Okay, critical first question I ask every guest. Are you a fan of In-N-Out or Five Guys?
Oh man. Well, I'm gonna have to show my roots a little bit here and have to go with Five Guys. I think that In-N-Out got oversold to me as a new Southern Californian. Much like the movie that was said, there's never been a better one. It's never going to live up to if you got that kind of hype early. I think I got a little too much hype early on.
Well, you're a rarity in the podcast. Everyone likes In-N-Out. There's a few go Five Guys, but we'll give you we'll let this one slide by as a new Californian.
I appreciate that.
Welcome to Season 2 of 10 Questions with 10 Pastors, brought to you by Gateway Seminary, with your host, Tyler Sanders.
I'm with Will Browning, who is a Send City Missionary with NAMB in Los Angeles. And you've been doing that for about 2 years. Is that right?
That's right.
And previously, you were pastor of Journey Church in Charleston, South Carolina. You also planted that church.
That's correct.
So my first real question here is just, I was just hoping you can tell us how you met Jesus.
Oh, wow. Well, kind of an unusual spot for me. I grew up in a nominal Christian home, went to college, joined a fraternity, and I had a fraternity brother who had spent the entire summer praying that one guy in the fraternity would come to know Christ, that he could hand it off to as he was leaving school. And I guess I happened to be the person that God had in mind. And I heard the gospel clearly for the first time while going to church all my life, but really hearing the gospel clearly for the first time in college through this fraternity brother, and gave my life to Christ in my dorm room, January 31st of 1996, Georgia Southern University, room 44 of Oxford Hall, which is now destroyed. So yeah, that's how I came to know Christ in college.
And how did you get from there to Los Angeles?
Wow. Well, I don't want to bore the listeners too much here because it's a long story, but if I could put it in just a few words, our church was a church that was really focused in on church planting. We did our best to serve faithfully inside the big family that is the SBC, and that just kind of kept us connected to NAMB. I had a friend that I went to seminary with, had kind of kept us connected through the church planting movement from NAMB and then what was happening at our local church. And he called me up and said, "Will, would you be willing to pray about leading a church planting movement in America's most influential city?" And what he didn't know is that just a few months prior to that, my wife had heard directly from the Lord that there was a big change coming. Now, I thought that she probably just needed to paint a room or, buy some new furniture. That's what I thought the big change was going to be in her heart. But after much prayer and a lot of tears leaving the church that we had planted, been there for 14 years, kind of gotten through all the hard stuff. And here we are now getting to the good times, and the Lord saying, "I got another big mission for you." But we wanted to be the people who were willing to give our lives to something that would ultimately be a big yes on the table. I think too often people give God a gift card kind of faith rather than a blank check. A blank check is, God, whatever you ask, however much, and wherever you want me to write the check to. But a gift card faith is, this is where you can spend it, and this is how much you can spend it. And we wanted to be a family that was willing to not be a gift card type of faith. God, you spend us however you want to spend us. So we said yes, packed our lives up, and came out to Los Angeles.
And could you tell me a little bit about what your work is like now? What's a typical day for you?
Yeah, Send City Missionary, my mom can't even explain what that means. Basically, my job is to be the chief strategist for church planting for all of Los Angeles through the ministry of the North American Mission Board, which is Send Network, is our network of church planting. But basically what we're doing as a team is identifying church planters, assessing those church planters, training them, coaching them, investing in them, and then caring for them. And we're just kind of running that play again and again. Right now we have 83 church planters that are a part of Send LA that are churches planted in the metro area of Los Angeles. So that's kind of the rhythm that we're running with each church planter.
What are you reading right now?
Yeah, one of the things I enjoy about social media and following friends is I got some friends who post books, and they'll just sort of say, I found there's no book to read that someone didn't suggest. Just picking something usually is a disappointment. But if you wait to receive something that someone suggested, so I'm always looking and listening. Probably the reason why you're asking the question on the podcast is to give some suggestions. But just started a book called Rembrandt in the Wind. It's basically like, how do you look at art through the lens of faith? Pretty interesting read. Enjoyed it so far. And then also been reading this book called Put an X Through Anxiety. Famous pastor Louis Giglio. Anxiety has been something I've dealt with all my life. So, one's kind of challenging me intellectually, creatively, and the other one's kind of helping me out when it comes to my own personal struggles.
I got a couple preaching questions for you, and I understand this may have changed a little bit for you. So, feel free to answer from like perspective of when you were, leading a church, or maybe now, like how you're approaching preaching, when you go to, visit a variety of churches now, and I'm sure you're preaching all the time still. But it's kind of a two-parter. So the first one is, what's your big picture approach to preparing a sermon, whether that be like a series or like, finding themes? What's your big picture approach?
I've always kind of felt different than most of my friends that were doing preaching ministry. I'm a pretty methodical, planned out kind of person. So for me, it always began with an annual retreat where I would write out 52 weeks planned for sermons. Usually that was sermon series, topic of the sermon, scripture, and then an order of how we would, use our communicators that are in our church. So that meant for me, I kind of had to put everything into groupings throughout the year. I found that if I finished a quarter, at the end of that quarter, took a day to start thinking about that same quarter the next year, I could kind of go, okay, what was good about this first quarter? What did our people need to know? The second quarter's got Easter in it. What do I need to be thinking about as we're going into summer? And what that did for me is I spent zero time every week trying to figure out what I was going to preach on, which I found a lot of guys can waste maybe even half of their sermon planning time just with that. But scratch that out. Then I would take the series that we had, and we were usually doing one of two things. We were either doing exposition through a book, or we were doing exposition topically. Now, what I would mean by that is if we're dealing with a topic, we're answering that from one passage in the Word. And we might jump off for some cross references, but it's going to be one central passage. So again, if we were dealing with anxiety, we're dealing with that from one passage, and then maybe using some cross references so that we stayed inside the expositional frame. So what that meant for me was right before we'd have our series, I would get our entire staff together, and I would give a 5-minute overview of what I wanted to do in each of these sermons in that series. And if we were preaching through a book, we're preaching through Acts, we'd break it into, parts of 6 or parts of 10, and then change it as we would go with different series titles, but it's still just walking through the book of Acts. But I would preach that in like a 5-minute set. Like, here's 5 minutes of this first sermon. Here's 5 minutes of the second sermon. And then I would just ask my staff, like, what would you see us doing if we were having a Sunday like this? And what it did is it created an excitement and anticipation from the staff that they could like, oh, I know where this is going. I know what's coming up. Now, that's ultra planned out in comparison to a lot of people. But for me, I can actually reduce my anxieties by having some of those things in place and then focus more of my attention on studying. So series, yes. Themes, yes. Exposition, absolutely. But probably the key components for me was just trying to stay ahead of it so I could best use my time.
Well, and the next question is I think it follows that line of thought. What was your week to week actual sermon prep like? It seems like you had a pretty good amount of the details worked out ahead of time. So what was it like whenever you were getting ready for that next Sunday?
Yeah. Well, I had somebody challenge me with an idea that I started with just one Bible college student, and then it actually grew into something that I'm really passionate about when it comes to sermon prep. And that was, I created a sermon prep team. Because I had already come up with the main theme for a sermon, because I presented it to our staff beforehand for their input, I could get a group of people together and say, hey, here are the 4 points that I'm going to do this Sunday. It's 6 weeks out, but will you take next week and just look at these 3 verses and just tell me if you got one good idea for those 3 verses. Every Tuesday morning, that group would get together and I would ask them, what's your one good thing? Don't give me 3. We would call it a hammer. Like, going to knock somebody out, Thor's hammer. Like, you're going to give me that one moment in the sermon that just really hits people. Give me that one moment. I would take notes on that. And then I would go from that meeting to my study, which is actually off campus, off of our offices. And I would spend the entire day doing nothing but sermon planning. My goal was to not finish the day on Tuesday until the sermon was written, because I was writing 6 weeks in advance, and we were doing video as part of as a multi-site, so video is a part of our life. I had to preach the sermon every Thursday. So I'm writing a sermon that's 6 weeks out, but on Thursday, I got to pick up the sermon I wrote 6 weeks earlier and deliver it to a camera, just in case things went bad. Now, most guys can't discipline themselves to do that. But I would say the best way to improve as a preacher today, like, how could I get 20% better today? There's a way to do that. And that is to preach your sermon one time before you stand up on the stage to give it to your people. We all know that 8 o'clock service, if you're doing 2 services, never gets the good one. The 11 o'clock service gets the good one. Well, we were at a time we were doing 4 services. And I started thinking, is it good stewardship for me as a pastor to know that there's a group of people who get my worst sermon? So what I started doing is I gave my worst sermon to the camera and hoped that it would never get used, because it's really just a backup. So, and the only people who really heard that one was, usually it was my assistant and the production team leader. And I kind of trained them to be really good feedback givers and feel safe to tell me that didn't work and this didn't feel good, so that no one got the bad one. I think anybody could improve today by 20% by just deciding, I'm going to take an hour or 30 minutes and I'm going to preach the sermon out loud to a room every week. You'll get better by 20% just by doing that.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's a really good, I think that's a really powerful practice, to be disciplined to do. Now, what's like the most difficult passage or topic you've preached on?
Well, my staff that every 4 years would convince me that this was worth doing again, but it would take me 4 years to decide that I could rebound from the pain before. But doing a question series of some sort, we did a question series where it's how does faith and science work together? Addressing issues of sexuality, if it's intimacy in the marriage, or the way that culture is shaping sexuality. And usually my staff wanted us to end that with a Q&A time. When the church was a little bit smaller, that felt fine. The bigger the church, the more of a target you are for someone to get you to say something you shouldn't say. Now, those series were great. People loved them. I even point people back to them. I thought it was good work, but it was really hard work to take a passage. If you're preaching through the book of John, and to take the next passage, do your expositional work for it. There's effort in that, but being ready for a big question that can be taken in 1,000 different ways. Was always just so much work. When our team would always go, man, that was so good. Our people loved that. Can we go back and do that again? And I would always kind of take me some years to get back to it. But I would say some of those were the most difficult, or dealing with some of the big questions that people have.
Yeah, I think it's really bold to take questions after a sermon. That's tough. I imagine that's brutal, or could be brutal. So let's talk about some roles and responsibilities in ministry. Like, why don't you tell me something you feel like is a sweet spot kind of for you, like as a real easy gifting, or strong gifting, and maybe a spot that's kind of a growing edge.
Yeah. I'd say two strengths. One of them you probably could get just by the beginning of this conversation: long-term planning, having a vision, keeping everybody focused on that vision. I don't get sidetracked as much as other guys do. Like, ooh, there's a new thing, let's go that direction. I'm probably a little too stubborn. So long-term planning was always a strength for me. In the job that I do right now, while this isn't the major part of my job, like if I do this all the time, I won't be successful. But if the thing I'm best at is helping a leader who's stuck get unstuck. Sitting down with somebody who's like, I just don't know what to do next. Can you help me think this through? Some people might call that coaching. Some might call it mentoring. I just say when a guy's stuck, if it's a ministry leader, if it's a pastor, if even if somebody was on my staff, I just don't know what to do next. I feel like sitting down with someone, helping them think that stuff through and getting unstuck before they leave is probably one of those sweet spots for me. I don't get to do it all the time, but I feel like I'm most helpful and maybe even most energized in those moments.
In those kind of conversations, are you helping people deal with, is that kind of like you're helping them kind of think through things on a personal level, or like the future of their ministry? What exactly does that look like?
I think in its best place is professionally. I mean, if we get too personal, then now if I have a gentleman who's like trying to figure out like, how do I get in shape, or how do I set some goals? I feel like I can do that pretty well. But the place that I enjoy doing it the most is professionally. Minister who's like, we're struggling to figure out what discipleship path we should make, or I'm trying to figure out how to do preaching in a way that it doesn't wear me out. And I'm going to do this for the next 40 years, but it's wearing me down. How do I, those sorts of, I'm stuck, I don't know what to do. I love those conversations.
Yeah.
I'd say swing and miss for me, kind of those moments that it's like, or even like regrets, I would say. I look back at my pastoral ministry. I think I had a good, strong personal prayer life. But I don't look back at seeing how I led our church to be a powerful place of prayer publicly. And that could have been as easy as letting them in.
The community kind of?
Just prayer being more than a transition of musicians on and off the stage.
Right.
Prayer being more than that thing that you do to start or end the sermon, but like really teaching our people how to pray. I don't even know if like weekly prayer gatherings, I don't even know what I would say I'd go back to, but I feel this conviction that I taught people how to study the word well. I don't know if I taught people how to pray well. And I look back at that as a swing and miss. I'd love to have another chance to do that.
Well, this is kind of related to that, I think, because it's about looking back. So you're a graduate of Southern and Southeastern Seminary. Mm-hmm. What do you think a student going through seminary, like what's something that you have to get in seminary? Or maybe I should put it this way. What's something that a student shouldn't leave seminary without? Like what's that critical thing a student needs to get out of seminary?
All right, I'm going to answer the question in reverse, but hopefully still answer the question. I watched too many of my seminary friends leave with only classroom experience. And it's really hard to get hired after with just classroom experience. I also had friends who had only ministry experience and no classroom experience, and I think they were weaker for it. I was forced into serving at a local church while I was doing seminary. And it was the greatest gift of learning that I had, because everything I was learning in my mind had a real life person to apply it to tomorrow. So if I'm answering the question the way you're asking it, it would be, how do you pair learning with ministry? Another thing that I had the opportunity is because I was serving underneath a pastor, I had a chance to make mistakes with counsel, not only of the pastor, but of professors. And I'm sure that I made some mistakes like underneath the care of leaders that prepared me better to not make those mistakes as a pastor now by myself, leading a church, away from seminary, now as a senior pastor myself. So pairing learning with ministry not only is going to make you more employable, but I think it's going to make you better.
Yeah. I think that's really good. My last question, if you could, what advice would you give yourself as a, first year pastor?
Wow. Well, I get to do this one often. Church planners are usually first year pastors. So this is a question I've been thinking about a lot lately, and we're investing in these guys. I would say this, the greatest quality that you're going to need to be successful is perseverance. I remember being in my first seminary class, Professor Chuck Lawless, intro to ministry class, when he said, look around the room, gentlemen, 80% of you will not be doing ministry 20 years from now. Unfortunately, he was right.
Wow.
I think what the application of learning could have been at that moment was, so learn to persevere, because pain is coming. Disappointment's coming. People not doing what they said they're going to do. Trouble with staff. I think the biggest quality we need is the ability to be steadfast in the midst of pain. That would be like the great quality. Then I would say, surprisingly, the thing that you're going to find you connect with people the most on is actually your lived experiences. So if you went through parents that were divorced, you're actually going to leverage that life in a way that is being redeemed. If you've gone through physical ailments, challenges, you're going to actually leverage those. So recognize that everything that you've gone through is now going to be the way that you connect with people to see their life change, because now you have a testimony, not just information to deliver. So lean into that, you've got life experiences. That's how you're going to connect with people. So don't be scared of that. Live openly, live a life of transparency. This generation can smell a fraud, fast. They've just seen so much of it, and they can also smell authenticity pretty fast. So if you're an authentic leader who's leading from your lived experiences, willing to persevere through pain, people want to follow that leader.
I think that's good. That's really good. I've done that a little moving myself right now. That was fantastic. Will, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.